So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons get to listen to episodes of the show early and gain access to a treasure trove of bonus content that I'm regularly adding to, including over 70 bonus episodes, the TV pilot screenplay I wrote with the novel's character, and more. Please check it out at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Last time I discussed kind of the overall nuts and bolts and basic choices I made in terms of shaping the final act, the last quarter of the novel. Now I'm going to lay out for you the very first story outline of the tales in that quarter for a story I call Inner Sea. That's a holding title for now, but as tends to happen with me in holding titles, it keeps growing on me. It'll probably stick. This story is kind of, I didn't plan it this way, but it evolved into being basically a companion to the previous story, The Gibbet, which is the end of the back half of the second act, where, in case you haven't heard of that episode in a while, Vo winds up imprisoned for her Conan-esque adventures in a gibbet by the side of the road, and a lot of stuff happens. Listen to the episode if you want to hear all of it, but at the end, she ends up being approached in her mind. She only ever hears a voice by a supernatural patron type thing. She doesn't know if it's a demon or a god or a wizard or what. And that patron's like, hey, I'll get you out of here in exchange for you doing my bidding for a set period of time, which I'm not going to elaborate on exactly how long that is. And Vo does her best to resist, and all kinds of stuff happens in the story, but at the end she's like, fine, just as the guy's about to impale her, an old enemy that's found her by the road. So you would think we would want to start with the very first mission, but I thought, let's leap a little ahead to when Vo has been doing stuff for this supernatural entity for a while. And yet, let's treat this first story as an introduction. So we come into it only knowing what I show at the first page. There's no preamble explaining her situation. But of course, I have to know what it is I want to establish in this story. And the main thing is the fact that Vo is being sent on big, wild, interdimensional, extraplanetary, we're not going to nail it down too much, but plainly she's going well beyond whatever planet she comes from. To do wild and crazy, often cosmic level kinds of things for this patron. What exactly is the patron's agenda? We don't know. But I do want to establish that the patron sends her on bloody hard missions that are bloody dangerous, and as a result, she can often get horribly injured or even die. And in fact, ultimately what I want to get across in this is that Vo is not immortal. She can be killed, but the patron will just bring her back. So why do we care if she gets killed? Why does she care if she gets killed? Aside from the fact that it's, pretty uncomfortable, whenever the patron uses its immense powers to aid her beyond anything along the lines of just plunking her down where, she needs to be to do the thing that the patron wants, the patron adds to her debt. If she's like, oh, I can't understand the language of this alien I'm talking to, can you make me able to speak their language? Well, that's another month of servitude, let's say. And the bigger the ask, with being brought back from the dead, a very big ask indeed, the more gets added to her debt. You can see how, given that she's sent on very difficult and deadly missions, this is basically the patron trapping her for an eternity of servitude. Even if she dies of old age, boop, she gets brought back. Oh, hey, look, she's, 30-ish, which is where I see her when this section of the book begins. And voila, she's back to serving him. So that is really the ultimate trap and the ultimate challenge of this entire section of the book. But we got to establish that in this first story in a way that isn't just a bit of throwaway exposition, or at least I don't want to do it in a bit of throwaway exposition. So other than establishing these base facts of Vo's whole situation for this back end of the book in a way that is hopefully compelling and narrative as opposed to exposition, etc., I just had a powerful urge to do a story about a character going deep, deep, deep underground. Basically spelunking in a kind of fantasy way where we ignore a lot of basic scientific facts to allow for certain things to happen. And I gotta be honest, this is one of the rare occasions where I did actually have an open mind in terms of being influenced somewhat by tabletop role-playing game material, specifically a book called In the Veins of the Earth, which, as the title suggests, is very much the author's very particular take on what people who play in D&D will sometimes call the Underdark. The space that is so far below regular-ass dungeons that things get very, very weird, and you have a whole new ecosystem. Authored by Patrick Stewart, but not that Patrick Stewart, and evocatively illustrated by Scrap Princess, In the Veins of the Earth is a largely system-neutral book, although ostensibly it's written with Lamentations of the Flame Princess in mind, and it does nothing else if not get you in a headspace, get you in a mood. So while I tried my best not to rip any specific concepts from it, it was fun to occasionally dip back in and just read some evocative passages and then come back to, my brainstorming for this. Another book that was very influential on my brainstorming and outlining of this story was Robert McFarlane's Underlands, which the title kind of gives it away. It's a book about being way the hell ass deep underground in a variety of environments and the implications of that philosophically and just to your basic physical good health. I strongly recommend it. There's a section of that book which talks about the challenges of storing nuclear waste, not just the physical challenges of storing it away from people in a way that we'll still know where it is and keep track of it, yada yada, but also a challenge of language and even culture that I found so fascinating that it wound up becoming the thematic conflict for this story that I was trying to keep in mind the whole time I was writing it, which is essentially, how do you create a warning which will outlast your own language? There was a lot in the book about this, but the one thing I'm going to read to you here was the idea that, quote, the same three tasks recur across cultures and epochs. 1, to shelter what is precious. 2, to yield what is valuable. And 3, to dispose of what is harmful. In my notes here, it goes on, shelter could be memories, precious matter, messages, fragile lives. Yield could mean information, wealth, metaphors, minerals, visions. And finally, dispose can refer to waste, trauma, poison, secrets. It continues, into the underland we have long placed that which we fear and wish to lose, and that which we love and wish to save. Now, I'm thinking about burying nuclear material, right? I also knew in the story I wanted something that we could see blending well with that and the other stuff I've mentioned so far, which is, in Sword and Sorcery, it's not unknown, particularly if you look at the older stuff from the 30s, to encounter the idea of a, quote, degenerate race. The idea that almost certainly humans, at one point, went deep underground or went to some other space where things are very different and very weird compared to where we normally run around, and quote-unquote degenerated into strange, maybe hairless, pale, very toothy cannibal weirdos or something. There's some variation on that. Maybe we grow wings, maybe all kinds of other stuff happens, but you get the idea. It's the idea that these people were once humans and what we consider people, but are now no longer really what we consider people, because they have been changed by their environment. I generally prefer Sword and Sorcery for how it doesn't tend to be littered with what you would call demi-humans if we were playing D&D. Basically humans, but not us. They got pointy ears or a big beard or whatever. Instead, you tend to encounter very different human cultures, which I think is more interesting for a whole host of reasons I've given on the podcast before. However, every once in a while, I do get the itch to tackle something that maybe is not really to my taste and see if there's a way I can do it that I myself would enjoy, and perhaps in the process find a new or at least somewhat more novel angle on the thing, in this case, the degenerate race. At first, I just asked myself, what is the point in a story of a sentient non-human race? There's someone we're more okay with seeing killed. They can be a simplified version of us, usually to help us see a part of ourselves more clearly. They can be there to explore an idea. What if us? But for one key difference. They can, of course, be a warning of what we may become, and can often be a metaphor for, frankly, miscegenation. Read your Lovecraft, kids, or don't. And yeah, believe me, I have pondered the problematic nature of the idea of a quote-unquote degenerate race, and also a lot of talk has been done online mainly in more recent years about the issues with the whole idea of, races in D&D, for example. All orcs are like this, all elves are like that. What kind of essentialism is that teaching people? So yeah, all that stuff's on my mind. Not because I'm worried about getting yelled at, which I don't think is ever the best motivation when writing a story, but just because I want to be thoughtful about these things. They matter to me, and I don't want to be lazy and just be like, they're underground Scottish people, let's say, and they're all angry. Every single one of them, except maybe the single one of them who proves is the exception that proves the rule. You could easily do a whole university degree centered on the idea of the other, and certainly the other as degenerate is like or less than, is kind of a mental survival technique regarding information overload. I can't possibly take on learning all about this, these people. So I'm just going to say, they're less than me. They smell bad, whatever. It's a maladaptive coping technique, to say the least. And I hear has caused some problems in real life. Meanwhile, the idea of a degenerate race, well, that got me thinking about a main part of the book, which is Vo's sort of moving from trying to perfect herself in the first quarter to trying to maintain a kind of stasis of just being like, I don't want to change. I'm all good. Everything's great. I'm having a good time, through the second act. And then here we are in the third act, and I know I want to get her to basically accept that life is a never-ending, continuing process, and that you're, up or down or all around, wherever direction you're headed, things are constantly changing, regardless of your wants and regardless of how tightly you cling on to any given moment. And I'm thinking about, okay, well, the idea that people are always changing, we're always evolving, our environment is always changing us, whether or not one considers it to be a quote-unquote degeneration or an improvement or a mixed bag. And I could see us starting this part of the book with Vo clinging tightly to the idea of stasis, of personal stasis, because she's just trying to hold herself together until she can find a way out of this servitude to this supernatural patron and get back to maybe the life she had before. Well, her opinion on that will change as we move along, but that's kind of where she's at, where we're starting. But I like the idea that even here in this first story, we're going to get the beginnings of the seeds of her being like, I think I got something better to move toward. I don't know when I'll be able to get it, but I'm going to start planning for it now. And this plays back into an idea that I've had on my mind for this book since the very beginning. You can go all the way back to, I want to say, episode 6 to listen to me read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which I choose to make kind of literal in this story by having it be where Vo gets her hands on a shoulder bag, basically, that she starts putting a single memento from each of her adventures in, something that will remind her of a valuable lesson that could come in handy later for what she eventually decides she wants to do, which is to stop being, the lone adventurer and try and actually settle down and build a community. So, okay, I've thrown a whole lot of concepts at you and a lot of talk, so let's, rally here for a second. Vo is serving the supernatural patron, but we introduce her in a story where she is acting on her own behalf because in the previous mission, whatever that was, we're just going to allude to a thing, she was poisoned, bitten, or stung by some horribly poisonous creature, and not wanting to add to her debt any more than she absolutely has to, instead of asking to be magically cured by her boss or letting herself die and then have to owe her boss even more, she has asked to be sent somewhere that is riddled with nuclear poison, but deep underground there's a community of quote-unquote degenerate people who are very good at curing poisons because they have to be to survive in their horrible environment. And so Vo is going to go there and convince them somehow to help her out before the poison in her system kills her, putting her much deeper in debt to her boss, which is the worst thing for her because she is concerned about essentially being an immortal, never-ending servant. At this point, I decided to make a list of likely story moments and things like that, just brainstorming, until eventually I got to the feeling of like, okay, so, we've got an outsider stumbles through foreign to them environment, overcoming culture shock and communication issues to receive what they seek from a helpful, native/other. That's my basic narrative at this point, and then I go, oh geez, yeah, this is clicking into place pretty easily because it's something I've experienced many times, and it's made for, frankly, an Anglo-white guy like myself. How can I make it more interesting? How can we put that special X factor into this tale? And so I brainstormed a little bit and I kind of was like, well, what if Vo isn't the first intruder to come seeking their excellent anti-poisons? What if Vo has actually brought something to trade and maybe even changed her mind about what to trade by the time she's in a position to do so due to the events of the story? Okay, right. What if the locals refuse to help her? And then she considers using force, but ultimately changes her mind, and maybe she lays down to die, accepting how much servitude will be added to her patron debt in exchange for being revived. This act is maybe what convinces them to help her. And the local, pal that she makes early on, the person of first contact probably, explains to the others what Vo had to pay in servitude earlier just to speak their language. Maybe there's that whole thing I mentioned earlier of paying a little debt to translate. Lord knows how much slavery being revived will cost her, yet she'll pay that instead of taking the cure, because taking the cure will deprive these people in some important fashion. Perhaps it's a case of they only have a small amount, and the amount that they have currently on hand, they need to save, the child of the pal, which is my shorthand for now, of the member of the degenerate locals that Vo connects with early on and becomes essentially their guide through their society deep underground. What if that? That felt good enough for a moment, and so I briefly deviated to come up with a list of nuclear waste monuments that have been come up with in real life, actually, as ideas for how to make the warning of, don't come here, nuclear waste, last well beyond our language into the many, many thousands of years into the future. The nuclear waste will still be dangerous. I also made a couple of ideas, for how these quote unquote degenerate different people could be a little interesting. I've always liked the idea that food is so scarce down there that they could, decide their hierarchy by rubbing their stomachs and being like, well, who's the most well-fed? Surely they're the most clever. So for the time being, they're the greatest in our hierarchy. I also was like, well, what if they're really pale, but they coat them, because they're deep underground, but they coat themselves in coal dust, etc., to hide from predators and sneak up on their enemies. That could be neat. But then I went to bed and I was like, I'm not happy with this. I'm not happy with this thing of Vo shows them that she's really great, and then they give her what she needs. It still just reeks a little bit too much of mighty whitey narratives from all kinds of adventure fiction, and from now going way back, actually. I was going to name a specific era, but it's never really entirely left us this idea of, the generally speaking white cishet male explorer going into the land of the so-and-sos and being like, well, I'm going to have some challenges early on, but ultimately I'll show I'm better at what you do than you do it yourselves, or I'll teach you the true meaning of love or loyalty or all these things. And just I don't like that. I don't like that. And so, like I say, I went to bed and I woke up this morning, being like, I don't like this. Oh, what if? And here's the big idea that ended up tying it all together for me. What if they just let Vo die? Vo fails, is revived with a great deal added to her servitude. Perhaps this is when we reveal the debt dynamic of her relationship with her patron. Aha! We come back to a favorite phrase that I use in this whole thing: order of information. By explaining the concept of debt servitude at the very end of the story, we save a bit of time at the beginning and allow us to just get into the adventure quicker. We also allow the reader to experience the story, unless they listen to this, being like, oh, well, Vo doesn't want to die. That's a pretty obvious motivation with the ticking clock of the poison. Okay, got it. And then at the end, it's like, oh, hey, there's a neat twist on that, and we get a better understanding of her relationship to her patron that propels us into the future stories. With that established, we don't have to explain it, of course, again in those later ones. It also does something which I like to do as intelligently as I can, which is defy reader expectations. It feels in this kind of story that it is a given our protagonist will get the cure. So to make the story stand out, we really need to explore her not getting it. And to keep it from being grim as hell, Vo needs to grow as a character and otherwise have positive takeaways. I figured this could be her first big step away from, stasis to continuing process, as I mentioned earlier, as a way of life. Her attitude towards killing might shift as a result of this. Like I said, she decides not to just slaughter the locals and take their shit. Her reclaiming agency through nurturance, which is an idea that's come up more than once, and this could be a thing here, where she feels a little more control of her fate, even if she is allowing herself to die when still healthy enough to maybe potentially take it through violence. She's like, yeah, no, you have the cure because you need it for your kid, let's say. And also it puts her a little further along the whole arc of the carrier bag thing by giving her the carrier bag. Maybe a small object we'll put inside, I'm not sure. Thus, she may be paying the cost of having added to her servitude in the story, but she has truly begun down the right path to escape that servitude. Ah, I like this very much. I also especially like it because it gives agency to the locals, in particular the pal, as I keep referring to him, to be more than just, the Tonto to her Lone Ranger or similar. So maybe the final act of this story is Vo on her deathbed, weakening, trying to be the proactive sword and sorcery hero, and as she grows weaker, trying to negotiate with her indigenous pal. He will, let's say he for now, I've imagined he and she at multiple points in this, he will not give her the cure, but he will talk with Vo, help her find a better headspace for her path out of servitude. He perhaps also clarifies some things for the reader about how Vo's debt works, in their conversation back and forth. If she is made whole upon revival, then perhaps he can remove some organs that would be useful in their medicine from the body that is left behind. Mainly, he confronts Vo's protagonist brain, encouraging her to turn away from the killing story, as it's described in the carrier bag, killing your way towards victory and glory and paradise and all that good stuff, and toward the carrier bag theory of fiction as a way of life. So, okay, she does learn from the locals, but I think that's cool because it doesn't lead to her then becoming better at it than them. It just gives her the 101 of their philosophy, and then she carries that with her, bettered by her encounter. Why does the pal do this? Why doesn't he just toss the weak Vo once she's too weak to fight back in a hole and be like, good luck? Well, I like the idea of them perhaps having an encounter earlier in the story where there's some horrible creature close to the surface and they bond over fighting it. So maybe we have something like that for sure, I think. Plus, I want to have a bit of action in the story, especially if we're going to have this very potentially grim feeling until, we get to the reveal at the end. Think of her just dying on a bed while chatting with a guy. I also really like the idea of this underground, quote-unquote, degenerate dweller having a kid, and the kid is kind of learning from this whole experience. And so the pal has maybe got the kid there and is more teaching the kid by teaching Vo, so to speak. And also reinforcing their own beliefs to themselves because it's easier to advise others than ourselves, right? I always find that it's much easier to tell someone else, like, don't stay up too late. It's smart to not do that. And then, you turn around and you do it yourself. I must admit at this point, I'm still kind of toying with the idea that maybe Vo is lucky they've been poisoned or the locals would eat her. Not because, they're ferocious, degenerate cannibals, but kind of like Dune and the way the people on the planet of Arrakis behave around water. They're just kind of like, you're not human to us, and calories are way too valuable down here to just leave undevoured. But okay, if I'm going to do this, then why won't they give Vo the cure? What's the reason? So I brainstormed a bit there, and I was thinking, well, they resent her assumption they'd give it to a total stranger. I think that's fair. It's also, as I think I mentioned already, the idea of it being very dear to make. It requires a very rare resource, very difficult, extensive labor, let's say, so it's precious in that regard. They also probably have a rule that only members of their community get it. I like the idea of this being, a sacred rule. They will not break it. Plus, Vo is going to leave, perhaps taking the value of the cure with her. Maybe once you've taken the cure, the cure can be kind of produced from you. So they're kind of like, well, what are we doing? If we put this in you, you're going to take it away from us, or this quantity of it away from us. So, okay, I feel like I've got the real meat and potatoes of this thing ready. We're going to have some acts. We're going to have Act 1, going underground, with the act out being a big, horrible creature. I must admit, I keep thinking of something I read in another TTRPG thing, the idea of a big giant that's bones are really just cartilage, so it can squeeze through the passages in a really disconcerting way. I'm going to have to come up with my own thing later, and I will. Spank me if I read the first draft of this at some point later, and there's a cartilage giant. But for now, that's a shorthand for the kind of vibe I'm going for in this. Anyway, end of Act 1, big fight, big weird squeezy monster that goes through the caverns to get people and eat them. Flee in Act 2, flee and fight and make a friend. That's the pal I keep mentioning. They fight and escape. Whether or not they actually slay the beast, I haven't decided. And the act out there, it would be arriving at the lake town, as I describe it. I like the idea of there being a body of water deep underground, and that's where the little settlement is of these locals. With Act 3 basically being Vo very quickly getting to a place of pleading for the cure, with the act out being our hero fucking dies. And then having a little epilogue of Vo hurtling through space via weird sorcery. No spaceships, but some kind of weird sorcery. I've decided I want to make it look like something kind of like what a Victorian would think, or a romantic. I'm going to have a thought about that. But now with the carrier bag and a sense of a better way forward. Oh, and order of information. Again, I'm thinking, well, what could I gain by telling the reader even later than the deathbed about the whole debt thing. Maybe Vo keeps that to herself. Maybe Vo is actually like psychically coerced to not tell people about her patron because her patron is very secretive. Okay, cool. So in that sense, that could make that final conversation even trickier for Vo and seem like she's just struggling with moral conundrums and poison. And then we're like, oh, when as she's rocketing through, the ether, the luminiferous phlogiston or whatever, to her next mission, after she's been revived, she ponders the debt and everything. And we get that context to kind of look back over the whole story. I also like the idea that, as if I move that information there, then when she's dying, we can have kind of fun crossfading, so to speak, from dying into sorcerer space travel at the end, making the latter sound like she's going to an afterlife. Hot damn, this is why I think so much about order of information, because I find so often that by withholding information till later, you can have really cool effects like what I just described. Some things you got to get out the way up front, of course, or somewhere in the middle. I mean, you can't hold the whole story till the end because then the story is not happening until the last minute. But, certain facts, if you're careful about where you place them, it's fun the effects you can unlock. So, okay, at this point, I felt compelled to circle back and be like, is my thematic, conflict working for me? Yeah, how do you create a warning which will outlast your language? Okay, well, fair enough. I also liked a secondary idea I had, which was just because you can't see something doesn't mean it isn't happening. But I don't know, that might be just like a background theme. It doesn't feel quite as strong as how do you create a warning which will outlast your language. And so how does the theme relate to the decision to let Vo die or anything else I'm doing here? Well, I kind of felt like, okay, our, native degenerate race person who at this point in my notes became a woman, so who knows what I'm going to do with their gender in the end. Anyway, not the most important thing. Our native degenerate race, pal, hopes the story will carry through generations, that however their people ascend or descend, they will know to take care of themselves first because of the story of letting a strange visitor die so that they may live. She makes sure her kid sees Vo denied the cure and understands why Vo is being denied. At this point, I felt good enough about the story that I was ready to go through my big Act 3 checklist that I described in the previous episode. Just flicking through, do we have a thematic conflict? Yep. Is patron debt a part of the story? Yeah, it's being introduced. What's the big cosmic horror? Well, nihilism of deep time suggested by the scale of nuclear waste disposal. That would make Vo feel pretty insignificant. How does the story re-enchant the world? Well, I feel like re-enchantment is unto the flip side of cosmic horror. Beauty and significance. So perhaps Vo's conclusion on the universe and meaning at the end of Flighting Fancy feels relevant, where, at the end of that story, basically the thematic thing is like, the universe isn't here to create meaning for you, dummy. That's what we do. Then we could also just have cool stuff like glowing moss overhanging the titular underground sea is an easy answer, which Vo should dismiss, I think. The true answer should be the deep time community of people trying to create warnings that transcend language and time in order to help people they'll never meet, who might no longer be what they recognize as people, a line of hands held across the gulf of deep time. And this could give Vo a desire for community. Right now she has no community, only a master. Relatable content for us all being isolated by late-stage capitalism? ? Another checklist item, how does Vo's attitude towards killing change? Well, fighting for a master you resent when death, quote-unquote, only means more servitude, has, I would think, taken the shine off of it for Vo. I like the idea of her maybe commenting obliquely upon how killing doesn't feel as it used to, but not spell it out that she's no longer getting a thrill like her, Conan-type days. How does she reclaim agency through nurturance? That took me a little while to figure out, but basically comes down to being nice to Pal's child, even though she is on her flipping deathbed. Eventually I decided, okay, maybe the kid offers her the cure when her parent is in the washroom or otherwise outside of the room, when the parent maybe leaves Vo to die right at the very end. And then Vo chooses not to let the situation her master put her in dictate her actions. And so she gives it to the kid, nurturance, and finding agency, and then dies. Do we have in this story turning from stasis to continuing process? Yep, the talk with the pal puts her on that path. We've covered that. How about Brian Murphy's sword and sorcery checklist? Honestly, I found all 7 things were there. Dark and dangerous magic is essentially Vo's whole situation of life now. Personal motivation, she wants the cure for herself. Horror, Lovecraftian stuff, cosmic nihilism, plus maybe some giant weird bendy creature. Is the story short? Yep. Will it be inspired by history? Pretty recent history, stuff to do with nuclear waste disposal, but yep. Is Vo an outsider? Oh boy, is she an outsider in this one. And are there people of action? Well, obviously Vo and her friend as well that she makes. I say keep using friend in quotation marks here, basically. So yeah, feeling pretty good about the checklist. I eventually kind of came around one more time for my notes on this and was like, do I need to put any more here about the, quote unquote degenerate people? And I made some more notes that I think will be interesting when people encounter it in story format. And then I also, this was a lot more to do about their beliefs, by the way, than whether or not they had 10-foot tails. But ultimately, I hit a point in my outlining where I realized, because of other stuff going on in my life, I had begun plotting this in April of 2023, and at the time that I was writing this last page of notes for the story, it was September. It was getting so stretched out, and I was like, man, I could just keep dealing with this thing forever. It wasn't perfectionism, but it was me realizing, like, at some point, just move on, man, just move on. So I basically just did a kind of summary page for myself where I was like, all right, we filled out our whole Act 3 and standard SNS story mega checklist. We've written an opening, which I'll read for you, by the way. I did write an opening. And I have a broad outline and the core ideas of thematic conflict to guide our filling it in. Let's organize our disparate notes in Scrivener and just move on. The only other thing I've really written since then was that there was a Michael Moorcock quote that I liked. The grand epics dignified death. They did not ignore it. That's taken from his essay Epic Pooh, P-O-O-H, which I mentioned, I think, last time. So, yeah, God, there's so much more you can say and do with the story, but at some point you just got to make that call, like, we're moving on. Reviewing everything for this recording, I think the only thing I would add is that I definitely have a little bit of concern that this story is broadly very similar to The Gibbet, where we have our character dying and then dying as a way of transforming and traveling to somewhere else. But what are you going to do? It's kind of a dyad, and if it's going to be a dyad, I'd like it to at least be two stories that are side by side and could be viewed, as such, a pairing, than be, me repeating something I did from the very first act. But yeah, looking in my notebook after this, I made a few pages of notes, sort of revisiting my thoughts on the whole of Act 3 after having outlined the first story. No need to get into all of that, except at one point I wrote in big letters, we need some Elric-style adventure. Damn it. Just as well, the next story that I'll be talking about with you is a very Elric-style adventure, a love letter to my favorite Elric story. The name of that tale that I outlined, not the Elric story, is Love Letter to a Sailor. All right, let's close with me reading to you the sort of absolute vomity draft opening to Inner Sea. Will you be keeping records of what I tell? Yes. Then I shall do as you ask, even though you were always there, sensing all I sensed, even the vilest missives my flesh conveyed. Mayhap it shall create a warning for others which can outlast my body, if not my language. Poison sailed upon my veins, pirates ravaging me after having poured in through the puncture wound gifted me mere moments after completing another thankless task. I turned down your generous offer of a cure, determined to earn it another way, in a place of my choosing, learned of in these involuntary travels. Poison filled their air, their food, their earth, their everything. Small wonder they were expert at curing it. I would find them deep beneath the sickly dirt, and take or trade for what I needed. I turned down your generous offer of landing me in their home. I turned down your generous offer of landing me closer to their door. I arrived in the usual way, some distance from their doorstep, doing nothing for my blood. The suit kept the air out. Always between me and the rest of this life, the suit. I can still recall the taste of the creatures with whose chitin I had to smith the damned thing. The field of thorns caressed my handcrafted carapace as I pushed through them toward my goal. The steel spikes striving up from the soil between them scraped my soles, impotent as anything had ever been. Menhirs, dolmens, monoliths, I know not what to call the looming, menacing earthworks blocking out great swaths of pale green moonlight. Had my mind not been elevated, educated, enervated by my previous tasks for you, I might have been given pause, been redirected, if not turned back. No, I'd not have turned back. As I pushed between two slate interlopers, I was stunned by a sensation from outside the suit. Heat. For a moment I thought my eyes had failed to adjust to the night, but no, they saw true. Before me the thorns, spikes, earthworks, all gave way to a jet-black circle on the ground, wider than made walking around it practical, holding on to a great deal of the past day's heat. I was tempted to shed a glove and blister my palm upon it, but did not feel like paying the price of indulging the urge. So I trod on. Even with the weight of my suit, my hammer, my sickly body, I had to fight the feeling that I was falling upward toward some distant sun. Perhaps an hour later, I reached the other side. I'd been staring at them for most of the hour. This didn't make the presence of cubes as grand as castles any less confusing. Once up close, my armored feet no longer made cozy by what must have been enough heat to boil an egg. I could see these cubes were not fortifications. They had no window or other portals of any kind, no engravings, no furrows left by erosion's smooth caress. I'd seen but a couple of towers taller than these dark grey creations, for I knew they were no natural formation, but both have been standing on mountainsides. And it was not them that had been destroyed when, perhaps another few hours later, this rabble of six-sided godlings gave way to what felt the final moat I must cross. The faintest remains of their castles before they fled underground. I let some of the finer pieces of their civilization run through my fingers, then moved on to the base of the mountain. I'd seen enough ruins not to feel like poring over this one. And then I was there. As I leaned against the calcified wooden frame of what may once have been a mine opening, I ran my tongue along my dog teeth. My tongue was going numb. But you felt that. You know what happened! Your voice. If I should get to live a life beyond this servitude, I hope, as years pass, I remember these tasks as dreams, if I remember them at all. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you soon.